Hello and welcome back to Azure Terraformer. Today we're going to be working with a different Terraform provider called the the Entra ID provider, formerly known as the Azure AD provider. Now, for those of you that have been working with Azure and working with the Microsoft stack for a while, this might be a tough pill to swallow. I know, I'm a child of the 80s, and although I know its name has changed over the years, the Sears Tower will always and forever be locked in my mind as the Sears Tower. Whatever they call it, the Willis Tower, the Who's What's It Tower, I don't know what. It will always be known as the Sears Tower in my book. Maybe that's what Azure AD is going to be for me. I don't know. But Entra ID, it's a cool name. Just not used to it yet. But we're going to be working with Entra ID using the Azure AD provider. On Terraform, it's still called the Azure AD provider. It's got a cool, slick name, Entra ID. So I don't think this problem is unique to Terraform. If you are working with Entra ID, you're probably going to have to be aware that it used to be called Azure AD for a very, very long time. And there's probably a lot of content out there that's Azure AD focused. Big companies renaming things, can't get away from that. It's going to happen. It's a fact of life. Might as well just accept it. So anyways, join me here on Azure Terraformer as we delve into the Entra ID provider and work with Entra ID. Today, I'm going to be working with Entra ID and the Azure AD provider to provision users and then assign users to Azure role assignments to grant them permissions within Azure. Entra ID has many, many different identity types: users, groups, enterprise applications, service principals, etc. All of these different types can be granted permissions within Azure. Now, within Azure, we do use managed identity quite a lot, which is essentially kind of like an automated and platform managed service principal, where you don't have to maintain any of the secrets or key rotation or anything like that. And we'll get into that in a future episode. But today, I just wanted to roll my own user using the Azure AD provider or the Entra ID provider and get off to the races using this really cool provider that complements extremely well with the AzureRM provider. So before we get started, if you enjoy my channel, please smash that like button and consider subscribing, and also consider joining the channel as an official Azure Terraformer. Whether you use the AzureRM provider, the Azure AZ API provider, the Azure AD provider to automate Entra, or the Azure DevOps provider, or any of the number of Azure-related providers that Microsoft has built, you can announce to the world yourself as an official Azure Terraformer. Anyways, without further ado, let's dive in and create a user and assign them a role assignment within our Azure subscription. So here we go. I have a few files stubbed out in this episode. I have a required providers block using Azure AD. I have already logged in using AZ Login interactively, and I happen to be a global admin for this account. So I think it's good to point out that if you're going to be working with the Azure AD provider and you're going to be logging in and provisioning resources, particularly like this one, the Azure resource, in the documentation, there's really helpful tidbits about what directory permissions that you need. And so whatever identity that you're going to be executing Terraform as is going to have these permissions in order to accomplish what you want to do. This can crop up in some Azure resources like SQL MI, for example, which requires certain permissions to be provisioned for that Azure resource. More on that in a future episode. But when working with the Azure AD provider, you have to recognize that you're operating at a higher level within the Azure and the Microsoft ecosystem. As we know, Azure has management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources, but at an even higher level, we have this construct of a tenant. And a tenant is what Azure AD or Entra ID now provides context across a number of subscriptions within Azure. So every Azure subscription is associated or linked to an Entra ID tenant, aka an Azure AD tenant, which basically makes that Entra ID tenant the identity provider for that subscription. So this is really, really important context to have. It affects how you authenticate against Azure, where your managed identities will be provisioned, and any other identity, whether it's an Azure Active Directory, whether it's an Entra ID group or user that you want to grant permissions to your Azure resources, you're going to have to know what Entra ID tenant your subscription is tethered to. So anyways, back to this documentation. As you can see here, in order to use this resource, the Azure AD user resource, which can provision individual human users, we need to be able to have this permission within the directory, user read write all. Now this is a pretty high level permission. Full disclosure, you may not have this permission within your corporate tenant. So this is important to bear in mind. If you want to work with the Azure AD provider and learn about the Azure AD provider, it's important that you have your own tenant that you can play around with. The good news is you can get an Azure AD tenant or an Entra ID tenant pretty cheap using an Office 365 subscription with your own domain. I have one for my own testing purposes with a domain name that I've registered externally. So this is a great way to get your hands on with automating Azure AD or Entra ID for not a lot of money. The nice thing about Microsoft 365 Enterprise is you really only have to buy one user. Once you buy one user, you can pretty much do everything that the Microsoft 365 administrators do for those super large accounts. So for $10 a month, you can basically operate enterprise scale identity management software. It's pretty unheard of. Back in my day, you'd have to have a whole bunch of servers with Active Directory installed on them, Exchange server, etc., just to have the opportunity to be able to gain the experience that you can gain for $10 a month with your own Microsoft 365 license. So if this is something that you're interested in, I'd highly encourage you to set up your own tenant, register your own domain name at GoDaddy.com or wherever, Microsoft 365 subscription, and become a global administrator within your own Microsoft 365 tenant. It's a great way to learn how to use the platform more effectively. Anyways, so since I have this access, I'm just going to go copy pasta this. I'm going to drop this in to my code and I'm going to create a user. And I'm going to call this Thomas Callahan III at Tinderholt.net. Now, I have to use Tinderholt.net. That's the tenant that I use for testing. So it kind of has to be that way. So let me just set up nickname. And for the password, let's generate a password.
A few moments later.
Okay. And so I think we're in pretty good shape. We need to load the random provider. And let me run Terraform apply and see what we can do here. So now I have two resources that I'm going to create, Thomas Callahan III with a random password, and we should be good to go. Boom. So here we are. I'm in the Office 365 or Microsoft 365 portal now, and I can go see that I have created a new user called Thomas Callahan III, and I can now go manage this user. I set up a password for Thomas Callahan III using Terraform. Probably not super realistic because I would assume that Tommy Boy is probably going to want to log in and reset his own password. So this is a rather academic scenario, but if you wanted to load a whole bunch of users and you had like a data source with an extract or a JSON template or something like that, that had a whole bunch of users that you wanted to load pretty rapidly, you could use Terraform to do this. And it wouldn't take a whole lot of code. You would just need to load that file, parse the various aspects of that Azure AD user resource block that we set up for Thomas Callahan, and then iterate either using count or for each across a collection of users, setting a unique email address, a unique display name for that user, and potentially a unique password. Now, let's look at how we can grant Thomas Callahan III access to our Azure subscription. So Azure has this thing called a role assignment. And so we can go grab an example of this from the AzureRM documentation in order to set this all up. So let me go add this.
A few moments later.
So we're going to use the current subscription ID. And now we need to reference the principal ID. This is one of those things that can be relatively tricky on the Azure platform because sometimes we have several names for the same thing. Client ID, application ID, principal ID, object ID, you get the drift. So now the question becomes, what should we put on the principal ID for this role assignment for Thomas Callahan III, given that it is an Azure AD user? Now, this Azure AD user is, I want to point out, because this is one of the cool things about Terraform, is being provisioned by a completely different provider. We are not using the AzureRM provider to provision Thomas Callahan III. We are using the Azure AD provider, which is talking to the Entra ID control plane. However, because all of these resources are being provisioned by Terraform, Terraform knows about how to talk to Azure AD or Entra ID and how to talk to AzureRM. And using the Terraform environment, we can connect one to the other. And so this Azure AD user, Thomas Callahan III, can provide inputs to my AzureRM role assignment. But I need to know what type of data that I should put here. Now, I noticed that principal ID is referencing an object ID. And so maybe that might give me some insight into what I should put in here. But I'm referencing an Azure AD user, and it's Thomas Callahan III. And let's see what attributes we have on this type of object. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and it's not super obvious, but there is an object ID. So let's try that for starters, given that was an existing example. Now, Thomas Callahan III, you got to understand this guy. His head is about to explode. His whole life sucks. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know where he's going. His dad just died. He just killed Bambi. He's getting his ass kicked. And every time he drives down the road, he wants to jerk the wheel into a goddamn bridge compartment. So we got to go a little easy on Thomas Callahan III here. Hence, we're going to leave him as a reader. So let's give this a shot. There we go. It looks like when you reference the AzureRM subscription data source, you need to reference the identifier or the ID for that subscription as the scope. And right now we're trying the principal ID being set to the Azure AD user, Thomas Callahan III, object ID. Let's see how this works out for us. The Terraform plan appears to be happy with this. Let's give it a try.
A few moments later.
And there we go. It looks like Thomas Callahan III has been granted reader access to our subscription. Let's pop into the Azure portal and check things out. And there we go. We see Thomas Callahan III has been granted access as a reader to our subscription. Now, let's say things aren't working out and Zelensky Auto is just coming down and just too much for the young Tommy boy to bear. We can just go ahead and destroy this just by running Terraform destroy.
A few moments later.
And there we go. Thomas Callahan III, Azure Active Directory or Entra ID user has been destroyed, as well as the AzureRM role assignment. So you can see that Terraform is making these changes across different services, across Azure and across Entra ID, which is an extremely powerful thing. So let's pop into the AzureRM portal and let's see that the role assignment is gone. Boom. And now let's also pop into the Microsoft 365 portal and let's see that the user has been removed. There we go. So I hope this helps. This isn't the first time that I've used the Azure AD or the Entra ID provider on this channel, but I want to dig into this provider a little bit more and show how we can use it to grant access to various Azure resources and also manage our Entra ID environment using Terraform, which is a distinct and unique capability that Terraform provides, both control over the Azure platform itself and the broader Microsoft ecosystem using platforms like Microsoft Entra ID. If you're enjoying this channel, please smash that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. And also consider channel membership and officially become an Azure Terraformer. It really helps out a lot. Anyways, that's it from me, the Azure Terraformer, signing off.